Okay, so Marxism and Latin America's Cold War, and particularly why Latin America was a susceptible place for the ideas of Marxism, socialism, and communism, and how that took root. So this is going to be a kind of term-heavy slide. You don't have to rush. I'm going to spend some time here. I want to set up what the basis is for this. So to introduce you to the man who then develops the ideas which then get applied in the situations we've been experiencing, I want to introduce you to the guy. His name is Karl Marx. He lives throughout the mid-1800s. He's born in 1818, dies in 1883, so he's never actually going to be alive to ever see a socialist or communist government take power. Never going to live to see it. He dies long before the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. He's never going to live to see communist China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, whatever. But Marx is writing in a time where his life experiences and the situations going on around him are going to inform him in a lot of ways that will relate to Latin America later on. He develops the ideas of what become known as socialism or communism that later inspire revolutions long after his death. And the big story of Marx's life that he's living through is the emergence of capitalism and industrialization, or what we call industrial capitalism. This is his big forming life experience. So let me start with the first term, capitalism. This is a term you've probably been exposed to, certainly if you took economics, but I'm pretty sure you got it in the US too a bit. But it's that system, it's the system we have kind of today, that much of the world has today, of owning private property and using that private property to generate a profit in the market. It seems in many ways so reflexively natural if you grow up in a society with that. But that was actually a problematic situation, a problematic system to Marx, because he's living as capitalism is really taking off, and particularly industrial capitalism, and he sees some problems with it. So Marx argues at the top here that capitalism and the market are exploitative. It's manipulative. It takes advantage of people, and it forces working people to accept lower wages. This is Marx's, one of his big critiques, his big criticisms of capitalism, is that it takes advantage of people. It drives wages low. And again, he's writing in the mid-1800s, so think of what you studied in US 2 about kind of the Gilded Age and progressivism and the emergence of modern industry, the Industrial Revolution, and so forth. Marx is one of those critics. He also says, this is unstable, this is chaotic, and here's the big takeaway that he concludes. It's kind of a dangerous idea that he comes to. He says, capitalism is so manipulative and exploitative, and it hurts the lives of working people so much, he says it's going to lead to a revolution. That's his big conclusion. He has this very linear conception of history. Predicts. He says that eventually, if capitalism keeps going the way it's going, it's going to burn out, and the people, the working class people of the world, are going to overthrow their governments and get rid of them. He's complementary to capitalism in a lot of ways. He says it generates a lot of growth and productivity, and it causes innovation. It creates these new instruments of industrialization, which he was just wowed about. I mean, think of him, he's living through this time period of great technological advancements. And he says that's probably necessary, but he says it's also doomed. He says that capitalism divides society into two groups. One group, I'm going to introduce that term right here, he uses a French word to describe it, he calls them the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie to Marx, this is what he calls the owning class. If you want to put labels on them, these are the bankers, these are the merchants, these are the manufacturers, the investors, the people who wield power in a capitalist market system. And he says the bourgeoisie are fundamentally different from a lot of the ruling classes from before. He looks back to feudalism, he looks back to ancient Rome and Greece, and he says, yeah, there were aristocrats, they were nobles, but they were pretty much in that position, pretty much just because they controlled the land. Marx says now it's different. Under industrialization, under capitalism, you can control lots of money, wealth, and the fates of people by simply owning capital, having access to money and property. So he has an issue with this bourgeoisie class. He says the other class, which he believes is the majority of the people, or what he calls the proletariat. The proletariat to Marx are the wage-earning, propertyless class, the people who go to work every day. They work, at the time, would have been 12, 14, 16-hour shifts. They got low wages. They never earned enough money to get out of poverty, or they never earned enough money to acquire property of their own. And he says that this proletariat class is being exploited. They're the ones being manipulated. And he says these are the ones that are going to lead the revolution. These are the ones that are going to overthrow that whole capitalist system. And he says this other term here, the means of production. This is a very key term to Marx because he says all of society revolves around who controls this means of production. It's a big term that he will constantly come back to. To Marx, the means of production are the raw materials, the machines, and the tools in society that produce things that people want. These are the factories. These are the resources. And whoever controls them, he would say it's the bourgeoisie, whoever controls them controls the society. So if you want to change society, Marx says, if you want to have class conflict, if you want to get rid of the capitalist system, you need to pry the bourgeoisie's hands off the means of production, and you need to take it back. Take it back for the proletariat, he would say. Socialism is this system that he argued. Remember, Marx says capitalism is cratering towards a revolution. He says it's going to happen, exploitation, manipulation, people are going to burn out on this. He says the next step, that capitalism will eventually be replaced by this new system, which he calls socialism. And then this pure sense of socialism, today it's a very kind of flexible word, but in the pure sense of socialism, Marx would believe it was where the state, government, controlled property, production, and the distribution of goods. No longer would it be independent private owners. It wouldn't be your factory owners. It wouldn't be your investors. It wouldn't be your property-owning class. He says under socialism, the government would take this over, and they would get people what they needed. And he said that would be seen as a preferable system to capitalism. So, to give you a visual representation about how a Marxist might see the world, this is a poster that was put out by the Industrial Workers of the World. It was a kind of socialist-leaning organization. They tried to organize wage earners throughout the world to kind of push for higher wages and better working conditions. This is called the pyramid of the capitalist system. At the bottom was this vast majority of what Marx would call the proletariats, the working people. They're wearing their workshop attire. They're kind of underdressed. Clearly, these are laborers of sorts. Above them would be your bourgeoisie class. We eat for you. And they're in the tuxedos and the dresses and living in a state of opulence. And then the other supportive classes that Marx would identify and other socialist-leaning people would identify, it would be the military, which he said supports the capitalist system, supports the bourgeoisie. We shoot at you. He's very critical of religion. He will say religion is like a distraction to people. It's labeled here, we fool you. And then we rule you, which is the government, which is basically controlled by the bourgeoisie, he would say, with money at the top. And that would be a way he would describe it. If you would like a refresher on this later on, if you're trying to get clear with what Marxism is, there's this video here, this crash course video, that might clarify some things for you. But we're not going to watch it here. I just wanted to put it out there as a resource. I said Marx was a philosopher, but he also kind of saw himself as a historian. He spent much of his life studying history and economics and acting as a journalist, writing to anybody who would listen to him. He looked back at history and he says, history is moving in this trend. He says, I've looked back at early hunter-gatherer societies, and it was pretty equal. I've looked back at the ancient Greeks and the Romans, and you begin to see a division in classes. He said there was a land-owning aristocracy. They controlled production because they controlled a slave population. But then we got rid of that, and then he looked back at like European feudalism, which would have been fairly recent history for Marx. He said there was a land-owning nobility, but they controlled land by having serfs, and they collected rents, and that's how they ran things. But he says industrialization, which was happening in his lifetime, the rise of machines and factories taking over older human and animal production. He says industrialization changes all of that. Capitalism, the rise of capitalism as a system changes all that. because he says this is where we introduce the bourgeoisie, and they get private ownership of factories. And he said that that's going to bring about the revolution. He said somewhere along the line, industrialization with capitalism is going to be this crossover point where a revolution is going to take place and the proletariat aren't going to put up with it anymore. He said eventually we'll get to what he called socialism, which is going to be a better system, and maybe later on in the distance you could achieve this new sort of stateless, no government society where resources could be distributed fairly. That was kind of long in the running. He really felt socialism was going to be this intermediary stage. He says history is defined by class struggle. The things that move history, Marx would say, is this class conflict and who gets control of the means of production. And he really believes that proletarians, the proletariat, the working people, they had to bring this about. He said eventually things are going to get so bad that they're going to have to rise up, they're going to have to overthrow the factory owners, overthrow the capitalist ruling system, and bring about this revolution. He thinks it's going to happen. He doesn't know when. So here's how this relates to Latin America. If you've ever found a really exploited people, I mean, exploitation happens in all parts of the world, but Latin America really had its share of it from the process of colonialism, colonial exchange, conquistadors, encomienda system, all of the first wave of revolutions not quite succeeding. All of that led the people of Latin America to be very susceptible to a sort of Marxist, being at least willing to listen to Marxism in a lot of ways. So I want to just close off our view of Marx here before I get to Latin America with this brief quote from Marx. It comes from one of his most famous documents called the Communist Manifesto. He writes this in the mid-1800s with a friend of his, Friedrich Engels. Marx writes, and what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to listen to this. We're not going to do a summary sentence, but I do want you to talk with someone sitting next to you, and I want to hear out kind of your interpretation of what Marx is saying. The bourgeoisie, remember the owning class that Marx talked about, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery which it batters down all the Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate or to give in. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. Here's your task. Take the next minute, talk with someone sitting next to you, try to just verbally come up, what's Marx trying to say? What's he trying to say about capitalism? Give it your best try. Some of this is wordy. Remember what the bourgeoisie is? It's the owning class. Okay, I'd like to hear what some of you think, at least a couple of you. Jake, what do you think? Please listen up. Yeah, it makes others adopt capitalism. Yeah, capitalism begets more capitalism. It really is a big part of what he's trying to stress here. Claire, what do you got? Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting take, is that like the bourgeoisie is definitely the one in control, the one in power here for sure, and they're going to try to extend that for sure. So I wanted to stress this quote because it relates to how Latin America will perceive capitalism and how it will perceive the United States and how it will perceive Marxism. Because there's a lot about this that might ring true to someone who grows up and lives the Latin American experience. If you're living in a ranch economy type situation in Encomienda in South America or Central America, or you're working on a sugar plantation in Cuba or the Dominican Republic or wherever it is, there's a lot of this description that you might read and be like, this describes kind of my scenario. So, why the appeal of Marxism in Latin America? Kind of got a little glimpse into that. At the core of Marxism is this belief, as you saw from Marx's writing there, is that capitalism goes out and ensnares people to enlist in its cause. The bourgeoisie are trying to get others to adopt its mode of production. That it's not just this benign entity that kind of exists by itself, but it is constantly reaching out for markets and connections with other people. So Latin American history is shaped by oppression and exploitation. We got that going back to the early waves of Spanish colonialism, the encomienda system, and the kind of semi-successful first wave of revolutions. And socialism, when you drill down into what it offers people, of the idea of the government taking over the means of production and distributing resources to people on the basis of their need, it offers some real tangible things to the common people, a Marxist would say. So one thing it tends to do is it tends to favor the redistribution of land, or what it would call the collectivization of land. It would, if a socialist revolution were to happen, it would mean that all those people who own private land or private factories, it would mean that they'd have to give that up to a new government-controlled type situation. So socialism offers the opportunity for the redistribution of land. If you're working harvesting sugarcane in Cuba, or you're working on a ranch economy in central Mexico, and you're living in a highly exploitative sharecropping type existence where you don't own your own land, you can never get ahead, you might look at socialism and you might say, this looks pretty good. I like the idea of being able to have control over my own land. I like the idea of my owners losing that control. Socialism also offers the opportunity to nationalize natural resources, which means put natural resources in the control of the government, not a private property. So if you live in a very mineral-rich society, like for instance Mexico had big gold and silver deposits, and it has other valuable minerals as well, coal, iron ore, and so forth, you might say to yourself, it'd be really nice if a private foreign corporation didn't own those mines. It'd be really nice if the government owned those mines, and they could give us the wealth that's created from mining that. And maybe we as the workers could enlist in that, and we could demand a higher wage, and we could support our families better. So again, that would be something that socialism would claim to offer the people of Latin America. It would also offer the creation of public schools, free education. That was a big part of what Marx calls for in the Communist Manifesto. Building public infrastructure, not just building stuff for what a private corporation needs, but in a socialist government, they might build things that everybody could enjoy. Roads, bridges, facilities, water treatment centers, things that everybody could draw upon, not just private corporations. And then finally, Marxism and socialism will favor the creation of labor unions, the idea that workers would be in charge of factories and that they could go on strike to demand a higher wage or better safety conditions. That would all be something that a socialist government would campaign on. And you could see, given the experiences of many people in Latin America, why that would be kind of seductive. Here is a cartoon from the early 1900s. This is how a lot of Latin Americans would see the United States at the time. This is Uncle Sam sort of instructing these unruly students in the front, and some of them are Latin American countries like Cuba and Puerto Rico, which were recent acquisitions of the United States. And a lot of Latin Americans would be sensitive to this portrayal. They would see it as the oppressive United States showing up and instructing them and treating them in a very condescending and controlling fashion. There's also some racial imagery going on in every corner of this. The United States had been a big player when it came to Latin America. Mrs. Clark gave you a version of this image, this map, on Friday. It was a regular occurrence for the United States to intervene militarily or economically in Latin America over the course of the 1800s to early 1900s. I'll just list off a couple of that. The U.S. is in Mexico in the early 1900s. Several occasions. The U.S. is in Cuba supporting on-again, off-again revolutions. The U.S. has troops sent to the Panama Canal Zone. The United Fruit Company, a U.S.-based company, is going to be involved in Guatemala. U.S. troops are going to be sent to Honduras, Dominican Republic, and other places as well. So again, if you're living in Latin America, the presence of the USA is definitely on your radar. So I want to tie this into this broader story of the Cold War. The Cold War, I just wanted to give you a quick definition. If you don't feel you need this definition, don't write it down, because I know you took this in US too, and you spent a lot of time on it. But the Cold War is basically this period of hostility between the US-led capitalist democracies against the Soviet-led communist nations from the end of World War II to the early 1990s. Basically, if you had to put a timeline on it, from 1945 to 1991, when the Soviet Union ceases to exist. That's the Cold War. The thing about the Cold War is that it was kind of a team sport in a lot of ways. The US-led side was always trying to get people to enlist in its cause, to ally with capitalism and democracy. The Soviet-led side was always trying to get people of the world to enlist in its cause. So you then had a situation where the two superpowers would be going to every corner of the world looking for support. So you look for the undeclared regions of the world. You look for the places that would still be up for grabs, people that can still be brought on your team. The US has an overall strategy in the Cold War called containment, which basically is this. It means stop communism from spreading beyond where it exists. We know it exists in the Soviet Union. It's soon going to exist in China. But the idea for the US was, if we just isolate it, if we stop it from spreading, we don't let it get a toehold elsewhere, especially in areas that might be susceptible to it, we will wait for its internal contradictions to force it to collapse in on itself. In many ways, containment's kind of like an optimistic strategy, which is stop it from growing beyond. Don't try a direct rollback of it. Don't try to force a confrontation unnecessarily, but isolate it and let it burn itself out. That's kind of the thinking. But containment means you need to be vigilant. You need to be on the ball, and you need to focus on those parts of the world that could fall to communism, that might have a socialist revolution, that might be kind of open to Marxism. You got to be on guard against that. So that means certain areas are going to be high priorities. Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America. Those were all undeclared regions. So those people, those hundreds of millions of people, they were up for grabs. There was this belief in what's called domino theory. Again, a term you should probably be familiar with, but I'll just restate it again. But it's this belief that if one nation goes communist, all others around it are going to follow. This is a very popular belief in educated circles of the U.S. government in the 1940s, 50s, and into the 60s. But it was this fear that if you didn't curtail communism, even at the smallest micro level, in places that seemed insignificant, if you couldn't convince local people in Southeast Asia, Africa, or Latin America to pick up a rifle and stop a communist government from coming to power, eventually they would. And that was kind of a pressure-packed situation. So we're going to do one summary sentence here, all right? This is kind of wordy. This is a unique document that kind of frames everything I just talked about in a lot of ways. It's called National Security Document Number 68, and it was given to President Harry Truman at a really unique moment in history. In April of 1950, you might be wondering, what's going on in April of 1950? Well, a couple things had just happened. Number one, the Soviet Union had just successfully tested an atomic bomb. So there's this big sinking realization that monopoly on atomic weapons that the U.S. had since the end of World War II, that was no longer in place. The Russians have atomic bombs. They're going to build more. It's just a matter of time before they get stronger. So the U.S. is about as powerful as it's ever going to be. Our edge is going to be slipping from this point onward. There's also the realization that China had just fallen to communism. Mao Zedong's communist forces had taken over. The Korean War still hadn't happened, but there was this kind of moment of, we have a real challenge ahead of us. We need to get our priorities straight. We need to frame our challenge very clearly. So this is the document that was given to Truman. Your task is to generate a summary sentence, and then we'll share out a couple, And then I do want you to transfer this to your reflection journal. Right now, just focus on your notebook. So here's the document. In a shrinking world, which now faces the threat of atomic warfare, it is not an adequate objective merely to seek to check the Kremlin, another word for the Russian Soviet government, design. For the absence of order among nations is becoming less and less tolerable. This fact imposes on us, in our own interest, the responsibility of world leadership. We need to be the leaders of the world. It demands that we make an attempt and accept the risks inherent in it to bring about order and justice by means consistent with the principles of freedom and democracy. Subject to this requirement, we must, with our allies, and the former subject peoples seek to create a world society based on the principle of consent. Its framework cannot be inflexible. It will consist of many national communities of great and varying abilities and resources, and hence war potential. The free society is limited in its choice and means to achieve this end. It's kind of referring to the USA. We're the free society, it's implying. The resort to force, to compulsion, to imposition of its will, therefore, a difficult and dangerous act for a free society, which is warranted only in the face of even greater dangers. The necessity of an act must be clear and compelling. The act must commend itself to the overwhelming majority as an inescapable exception to the basic idea of freedom, or the regenerative capacity of free men after the act has been performed will be endangered. The Kremlin, again another word for the Soviet government, is able to select whatever means are expedient in seeking to carry out its fundamental design. At the ideological or psychological level, in the struggle for men's minds, the conflict is worldwide. What is this trying to impress upon Harry Truman as he's reading it? What's the basic gist? Take a couple minutes, generate a summary sentence. I know it's wordy. Focus on some key words that you think impart some meaning here. Many people just take some different things. You're going to transfer it to your reflection journal right now. I'm just going to put it in notes. Yeah. Flesh that out a bit, but you're on the right track. If you want to talk with someone next to you, that's fine too. There's no one singular sentence that's going to capture this perfectly. It's a complicated document. One of the tasks you experience in this class is you look at complicated documents and you try to make sense out of them. Try to capture their gist, their essential meaning. Okay, let's hear out from some. Taylor, could you generously share yours? Yeah, the Soviets are gaining power. They're going to use any means to try and spread themselves, and it's urgent that we try to stop it. Yeah, that's a big takeaway. If I'm walking away from this meeting, what's my essential I need to know? Soviets are a threat. They're expanding. We need to use, and they're going to use any means at their disposal. We need to figure out a game plan on how to deal with it. Let's go another one here. Jasmine, can you share with us? Okay, yeah, I mean that language isn't used, but I see you're definitely drawing a parallel with that previous racial ideology from the age of imperialism for sure. Let's see, who can we get? Catherine, what do you got? I think that's a really good essential. We have to come together to prevent conflict and expand freedom worldwide. Yeah, the only thing I might quibble with is it kind of does say conflict might be necessary. We want to avoid it, but if it's an inevitable thing, if that's what it takes to resist the spread of communism, this document opens the door to it. Thank you for sharing those out. I know this is a challenging document. Transfer this to your reflection journal and title it National Security Council 68 with the date. So Mrs. Clark gave you this image in her Friday lecture. I just again want to reemphasize the point. The U.S. is showing up in Latin America in a big way throughout the Cold War. I mean, these are just some of the examples. They're going to be in Cuba. They're going to be in the Dominican Republic. They're going to be in Nicaragua. They're going to be in Chile. They're going to be in Brazil, all over the place. Venezuela later on. So this is really important because this is the tangible, physical reality of how the Cold War affects Latin America from a U.S. perspective. So if your goal, if you've read that document and you're Harry Truman and you're looking for ways to stop the spread of communism to those up-for-grabs people in Latin America, you are going to maybe arrive at some of these conclusions that the U.S. does. So this is a list of tools the U.S. will call upon to stop the spread of communism in Latin America specifically. One thing they developed is called the School of the Americas, which is a U.S.-funded training system based in Georgia, but they have outposts all over the place, which supports training anti-communist insurgency movements. Remember I said it's important that if you want to stop the spread of communism, if you want to stop those dominoes from falling, you need to convince people to pick up a rifle and make it happen? This is what the School of the Americas tries to do. It brings in anti-communist people from every country throughout Latin America. Got an anti-communist in Honduras, got an anti-communist in Venezuela, in Chile. Bring them to the U.S., train them up in how they can resist this. Military tactics, governing tactics, train up the leadership. That's what the idea is. School of the Americas. This is actually going to last into the early 2000s, kind of under a different guise, and it's been since reconstituted. It had a big role in the late 80s, early 90s. After the Soviet Union fell, it kind of refocused itself on stopping drug cartels in Latin America. So that's kind of how it's evolved since then. The Alliance for Progress, that sounds really kind of positive. This is something that was created during the administration of John Kennedy. Kennedy, when he comes to power in 1961, he's going to say, if you want to stop the spread of communism, you need to give the people of Latin America hope that life is going to be better. We need to make sure that capitalism can be effectively modeled in Latin America. We need to boost their economy. We need to build their homes. We need to make them prosper. What he wants to do is give them money, give them financial aid, create a Marshall Plan for Latin America. It's kind of a way of describing what the Alliance for Progress was. Boost their GDP, make them more prosperous, build them schools, build them infrastructure, get U.S. companies down there employing people, and they're not going to want to turn to communism. This is sort of the positive face forward of let people see that there's an alternative to a socialist system. And then the Peace Corps. How many of you have just heard of the Peace Corps before? Just know it's a thing. I mean, it's a volunteer program that's created in 1961. Again, something that Kennedy creates early on in his administration. It's for college graduates, U.S. college graduates. You could enlist like you were enlisting in like the armed services, and you could go throughout the world, and you could do things like build homes, teach English, drill wells, whatever your skill set may have been. They can send you to a part of the world where you can effectively represent the USA. You could demonstrate through these micro interactions with people that the USA is friendly and here to help, and it's going to be a positive foot forward in the world. So those are all kind of like more positive, less confrontational tools in the tool chest. Then there are coups, assassinations, and proxy wars. A coup is where you overthrow the government, or you support the overthrow of the government, or you look the other way while someone you know wants to overthrow the government does it, and then you don't do anything about it. Then there's assassination, and that's just pretty blunt and to the point, which is if there's a Marxist leader who took power and they're a threat, you assassinate them, or you support somebody to secretly assassinate them. And then there's what are called proxy wars, meaning let's say a government comes to power that you don't like. Let's say this socialist government does come to power and starts nationalizing U.S. business interests or threatening U.S. Government in some other way. It means you could give weapons and financial aid to a rebel group who fights that person. So you're not directly fighting them, but you're supporting someone else to fight them. That's what's called a proxy war. And these pictures here capture all of this. This is Kennedy promoting the Alliance for Progress. This is the Peace Corps volunteer teaching English in Latin America. And then this is a picture of Fidel Castro, a guy you're going to read about over the coming week, celebrating the fact that the U.S. tried to kill him and failed. Plot to kill Castro, and that's going to be numerous. Quick review, and this is not new stuff. Mrs. Clark talked about how in many cases the U.S. was successful in affecting governments in Latin America. Guatemala in 1954, the U.S. successfully ousts the Arbenz government, which had started redistributing land and taking land away from the United Fruit Company. So that was a success story from the U.S. perspective. One not success story, I guess you could say is kind of a failure story on the part of the U.S., is what happened in Cuba. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of the story here because your reading and Mr. Ellenbecker are going to talk about this. But in the 1950s, a gentleman named Fidel Castro is going to lead a guerrilla army. He's going to be kind of socialist-leaning, although that will be unclear early on, that overthrows that U.S.-backed regime in Cuba that you read about in lab, called the Batista regime. Castro wins. He overthrows Batista, even though Batista had all of this U.S. support and backing in Cuba. Castro, when he comes to power, he begins to nationalize and take over Cuba's sugar industry for the government. And here's his kind of big mistake from a U.S. perspective, is he begins to ally with the Soviet Union, which if you want to make enemies with the United States in 1960, you don't want to be allying with the Soviet Union. Castro does. He takes Soviet military support and financial support. The U.S. tries to respond by trying to assassinate Castro, and we're going to see a clip here of what that was like. But remember I said it was a story of kind of failure on the part of the U.S. because Castro succeeds in repelling a U.S.-supported invasion in 1961. Now, I wanted to show you this short clip from how Castro handled his situation in Cuba when he came to power.
Tractors. But tanks and other weapons too. In March 1960, there was an explosion on an ammunition ship in Havana docks. At least 75 people died. Castro blamed the Americans.
Fidel Castro suggested was sabotage, a variable for knowledge and approval of the U.S. government.
Cuba was on a war footing. America's CIA began targeting Castro. There were plots to kill him using poison pens and pills.
You saw these pictures?
Even exploding cigars. Castro reveled in the CIA's bunker.
And I don't know the war at all. Niños, nunca fueron capaces de entender.
They never understood that the best way to fight Fidel Castro is not to confront him. Because where can he go from there? He wouldn't have known what to do because he needs a confrontation. And that's what the United States were useful for. Fidel loves the US. He did everything he wanted.
He's the hero. He's David against Goliath.
Deep in the Florida Everglades, the CIA was working with hundreds of Cuban exiles on a bold plan to invade Cuba.
So this story, remember, it gets back to that tools in the toolbox of what the U.S. can do to stop the spread of socialism or communism in Latin America. That's some of it all in action. They try to assassinate Castro. They try to train up people to overthrow his government through a proxy war invasion. So it kind of raises the question of what is the communist world, what is Latin America, people who are pro-socialism, what are they doing in response to the U.S.? And I just want to introduce you to this guy who will kind of be a key representative of what the communist world can do. You don't need to get this stuff down here because that will come out on Monday when we watch the film clip, but I wanted to put it out there if you wanted to go a little bit more in depth in it. So this guy that we're going to be introduced to, his name is Ernesto Che Guevara. And he's going to be one of Castro's right-hand people in his Cuban Revolution, but Che has kind of a career that's independent of Castro in a lot of ways. To give you some bio on him, Ernesto Guevara, or he got the nickname Che later on, he lives a fairly short life. He dies before the age of 40. He's an Argentinian-born doctor who's inspired by Castro when he meets him as a young man, and he decides to just join this Cuban Revolution. He helps Castro go to Cuba and invade. He's one of his real close lieutenants. But he comes to a conclusion pretty early on in his life, Che does. He sees capitalism as the new imperialism. He looks at it in this long history of Latin America. He says what the U.S. is doing, what capitalism and markets are doing, this is exactly what we've experienced for centuries, and I am against it. And Che comes up with kind of a counter. Well, he doesn't alone do this, but he enlists himself in this counter strategy in Latin America, and he sees this. He sees that revolutions that won the hearts and minds of the common people, the common peasant of Latin America, that they could tie down nations like the U.S., and they could force the U.S. and other powerful entities throughout the world into a perpetual war that they can't win. So Che commits himself to fighting what we would call guerrilla insurgency movements. They pull it off in Cuba. Castro takes power in Cuba. Che later goes on to help Castro establish an alliance with the Soviet Union. Castro has so much confidence in Che, he appoints him head of Cuba's national bank. Che does some things that are kind of problematic for Cuba. He convinces Castro to let the Soviet Union install nuclear missiles in 1962, which kind of leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Che is kind of involved in that. He later has a falling out with Castro and decides to go abroad. He goes to Africa, goes to the Congo, he goes to South America, to Bolivia. Eventually, his story comes to an end that he's hunted down and killed with the U.S. CIA support, but he's later on declared a hero by Castro, and he's declared a hero in Cuba today. But he's representative of what the socialist movements in Latin America will try to do in response, and that is tie the Americans down in perpetual war, guerrilla insurgency movements. This is kind of a funny slide. Maybe 6 people will laugh at that. Okay, another example, just quickly, you've got this story from Mrs. Clark last week, but I just wanted to represent it again. In Chile, you read about the Pinochet government in Lab. That was a U.S.-supported dictatorship that ousted a democratically elected government under Salvador Allende. It's another one of those examples of what can the U.S. do in Latin America? Well, it can overthrow the government in a violent coup. And later on, thousands of people are going to be killed, arrested, and tortured. And it leads to one of those moral trade-offs that the U.S. will experience in the Cold War, which is you got to back some dangerous and corrupt and problematic governments if you want to stop the spread of communism, but you also have to do that in a way that still kind of promotes the prosperity and livelihoods of the millions of people so they stay on your side. And it's a complicated, fraught question. Final slide. One last example in Latin America where we see this Cold War playing out, where we see this tension between communism and capitalism and democracy playing out. And this is fairly modern. This is, within the past 40 years. This is towards the end of the Cold War. They don't know it's going to end back then, but towards the end of it. Nicaragua, there is a proxy war between 2 groups. One is called the Sandinistas. They're going to be kind of supported by the socialist-leaning governments of the world. The Soviet Union's going to support them. Castro's going to jump in and kind of support them in some ways. And there's going to be a group called the Contras, which the U.S. is going to support. But this kind of messy story kind of leads to a number of things, in some cases a political scandal in the United States, but also it's the Cold War in action. It's a micro-example of the Cold War. So the U.S. had long supported, going back to the 1930s, a U.S.-friendly government under a guy named Somoza and his family. They call it the Somoza family regime in Nicaragua. Somoza, they have a strong run with the USA, but they get overthrown in 1979. Somoza government. That's a problem for the U.S. because the U.S. is saying, well, this is our U.S.-friendly government. Now they're overthrown. Now what happens? So Somoza had been friendly to U.S. industries, and this rebel group that wins in 1979, they're called the Sandinistas. And the Sandinistas, while they overthrow the Somoza government, they hold true to their promise. They hold democratic elections. And in a couple years later, they win a pretty big chunk of the vote. There's this guy right here. He's on the cover of Time magazine. His name is Daniel Ortega. He's still alive, actually, today. He was a young guy when he took power. He's elected president. He wins strong majorities of the vote. This is kind of a big public relations blow for the United States because this socialist-leaning government takes power, it wins elections, and they're now kind of allied with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union jumps in and they support the Sandinistas. They give them military and economic aid, like you'd expect the other side to do in the Cold War. The U.S. government, not to be outdone, under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, they begin to support a rebel group who fights the Sandinistas. This rebel group, as I said before, they're called the Contras. So it's like I said, Cold War in action. Soviets are supporting the Sandinistas, U.S. is supporting the Contras. It's a proxy war type situation, even though the Sandinistas kind of win power. The U.S. Congress decides to jump in the 1980s. The U.S. Congress passes a law that cuts off funding for the Contras. It says, yes, we know there's a Cold War going on, but the Sandinistas were democratically elected, and we probably shouldn't be fomenting a revolution in a country that's like 700 miles away from Texas, so we're going to cut off funding. So the Sandinistas are still in power, and the U.S. presidency or administration under Ronald Reagan doesn't want to really give up this fight. So what happens is people within the Reagan administration in the early 1980s, they figure out a way to get around Congress's law. They figure out that they could sell weapons to Iran, another country in the Middle East, and use that money and secretly funnel it back to the Contras without Congress knowing about it. Now that's a problem because that kind of violates a law of Congress, and that's a crime. And people in the Reagan administration are accused of committing this crime, and that raises a big question. If a presidential administration commits a crime, did the president know about it? And if the president did know about it, was the president complicit in a crime? And this launches a huge scandal in the mid-1980s called the Iran-Contra affair, or the Iran-Contra scandal. And the question was, it was very complicated with many different people and parts, but the bottom question was, did President Reagan know that somebody broke the law and illegally funded money to these Contras against the Sandinistas? It's never quite concluded. If you go back and investigate this, there's a lot of documents that were destroyed. Some people are arrested for lying to investigations, and it's never really clear. Reagan says he didn't know about it, and other people high up in the administration kind of confirmed the same thing. And ultimately, Reagan avoids impeachment. It's a very close call. There was a period of time in 1987, 88 where he wasn't sure what was going to happen. But in the end, the Sandinistas hold power for a couple more years. In the early 1990s, they get voted out of power, and the Contras come back, but then Daniel Ortega will come back, and he'll continue to be kind of an important figure. But I mention this because it's an example of all the lengths people will go, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, in the Cold War to win the hearts and minds of people. And I want to close with this picture. These are pictures from Nicaragua in the late 70s, early 80s that the U.S. is airdropping to the common people. Remember, much of the Cold War is winning the hearts and minds of the common people. Are you going to be on Team Capitalism, Democracy, or Team Communism? Please hold up, folks. We got 2.5 minutes. I will give you time to pack up. And these pictures, they tell you basically to cut telephone wires, to cut cables, to listen in for rumors, to how to let the air out of tires, how to do things that are, acts of sabotage. And I mean, these little micro ways of communicating with people are ways that the United States and the Soviet Union would do kind of similar things in response, would be able to kind of wage this battle. Remember, every person that you can get on your side is a person that could potentially sway the control of a country. And if who that country aligns with, that's a question of the Cold War. But it gets back to how Latin America was this battleground for the Cold War. And that's something I want us to be cognizant of. Any questions? All right, you can take the next minute to pack up. We're not leaving yet. We got like another minute before full dismissal.